The Lavender Scare documentary. Many of you have heard about the Red Scare, the congressional witch hunt against communists during the early years of the Cold War, since it is a well-known chapter of American history. A second scare of the same era has been much slower to make its way into public conscious, even though it lasted far longer and directly impacted many more lives, which is the Lavender Scare. Beginning in the late 1940s and continuing through the 1960s, thousands of gay employees were fired or forced to resign from the federal workforce because of their sexuality. This meant that their source of income was taken away from them. Many of them without income could not find a way to feed themselves. They believed that homosexuals were mentally ill. They believed this because the homosexual people liked people of the same sex, and for them that wasn't normal at the time. At that time, being gay or lesbian was treated as a crime. During World War II, physiatric screening directives and procedures introduced the military the idea that homosexuals were unfit to serve in the armed forces because they thought that they were mentally ill. By 1943, homosexuals were banned from all branches of the military. In 1947, at the beginning of the Cold War, the concern about internal security was increasing. The State Department began campaigns to rid the department of communists and homosexuals because they believed they could be easily manipulated. They believed if one of the homosexuals was kidnapped, it would have been easy to get information out of them. The government also believed that they could be used as communists if they persuaded them long enough. Even before 1947 establishment of the State Department security principles, the United States military had developed discriminatory policies targeting gay men and lesbians. Even after fighting for their own country, they were treated badly and were harassed. They were called perverts and many other harsh things, insulting them out of their jobs and bullying them out of their jobs.
They targeted the gays, informing that they were being tracked and hunted down. They didn't know that to the Cold War State Department. They thought if the gays were mentally ill, they couldn't focus or even work right, so they excluded gays from working and kicked them out of working offices. So jobs for gays were very hard to include them during the Lavender Scare. You might think that their targets were suspected communists. After all, it was the height of the Red Scare and Cold War paranoia. But the State Department's targets weren't suspected communists, and the sweat wasn't run by Joseph McCarthy. Instead, LGBT people were in the crosshairs accused of unfitness to serve, condemned as perverts, and bullied out of their jobs. They were systematically targeted for their sexual orientation. It was the contest between the late 1940s and early 1960s that thousands of gay employees were fired or forced to resign from their jobs upon a combination of homophobia and communist concealed, resulting in a loss of livelihood for many gay people. Eisenhower's 1953 executive order was really part of a decades-long government assault on homosexuality. Due to this, they were put in jail and also accused for being communists working under spies. President Dwight Eisenhower signed an executive order in 1953 barring gay and lesbian people who he called sexual perverts from government jobs and sexual clearance. Headlines and shouted the news began purging government of homosexuals. Compared to when their Lavender Scare was, they were scared of the gays. But now in 2019, they decided to allow gay marriages, or in 2017, a protective government for the gays, and also weren't as targeted as they were back then. While when the Lavender Scare or the Red Scare was active, they were scared that the communists would invade with gays as undercover for blackmailing the gays. But why they were fired from their jobs and facilities but abandoned at different shed led to a much wider purge of gay employees. Homosexuals must not be handled top secret material. McCarthy said the pervert is easy to prey to the blackmail.
Interrogations of homosexuality became commonplace in the 1950s and 1960s federal workplace. Questions like, do you identify as a homosexual? Have you ever had same-sex relations? Were commonplace as employers attempted to rule out LGBT employees. The Lavender Scare made being publicly LGBT difficult. Although homosexuals were largely closeted before the Lavender Scare, being publicly LGBT during the 1950s was challenging and near impossible without high consequences. Several LGBT people later stepped up to challenge the federal government's sexual perversion components, including civil servant Frank Kameny, who took his case to the Supreme Court. Although Kameny lost, a few federal courts began ruling in his favor about 1969. More gay rights organizations also developed, such as the Medici Society as well as Daughters Abilities. The Lavender Scare not only broke up and quieted the city's LGBT communities, who were all afraid of federal employment discrimination and potential hate crime, but it also resulted in largely conservative homosexual culture within the government.
Being publicly LGBT during the 1950s was largely challenging and nearly impossible without staggeringly high consequences. Not only were LGBT federal employees fired, but others were also simply fired for, quote, guilt of accusation, end quote. In knowing someone who was LGBT, and because of those people getting fired, and without a job, they were led to suicide, which then their deaths were covered up by the federal investigators. Due to gay people losing their jobs, and as I stated before, some led to suicide, they went to court to try to fight such stupid laws, such as these cases, like the Metashian Society in 1950, as well as the Daughters of Billets in 1955. Some of these cases were won like the ones that were previously brought up, and others weren't. And if they were won, then those people weren't protected by law and would get beat and harassed. While most federal organizations overturned their policies on LGBT or discrimination, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or otherwise known as the FBI, and the National Security Alliance, or otherwise known as the NSA, ban on homosexual lasted into the 1950s until they were officially overturned by President Bill Clinton in 1995. And after that, people that were gay and didn't have a job, they were able to get rehired again. Gay people in the past couldn't get jobs back then, but now gay people can get jobs and not get rejected for being gay. There are still some people, for example, like Christians, that believe being gay is a sin, or people that still think that the past is the present and which are considered homophobes. There is still some conflict between heterosexuals and homosexuals in other places around the world, but aside from that, gay people are welcome in today's society.